Hello and welcome to the MilVet Podcast. Your podcast hosts are Brendan Aronson and Tim Shaw. We are military veterans, entrepreneurs, and investors. Most importantly, we strive to empower military service members, veterans, and their families. We believe that every veteran deserves a career that fires them up, a career in which you can learn, earn, and build a world-class network. On this podcast, we interview civilian and military veteran leaders who are incredible founders, writers, thinkers, and investors. Our primary goal is to inspire you to achieve great things. Let's dive into today's episode.
Today's guest is not a veteran himself, but a fantastic and acclaimed writer, historian, media leader, competitive runner, and CEO of the Atlantic Media, Nick Thompson. Media is one of the most important functions in our society. A lot of military veterans do not fully appreciate the impact of the media on our society. Nick is a runner, but he's a triathlete in the fullest sense in that he does many things well. A media leader, a writer. He understands how technology impacts media. And he's had a T-shaped career, a breadth of understanding across many different industries and topics, but he's really an expert across two things. So maybe less T-shaped than W-shaped. He's an expert on Cold War history and the media business. It's a privilege to welcome Nick Thompson to the show today. Nick, you've been the CEO of the Atlantic magazine, or really Atlantic Media, since February 2021. And I'm curious, what are some of the most interesting military or military veteran news that's happening now? And what do you think is most undercovered?
Great question. Thanks for having me on, Tim. I think that right now there is a fascinating question about the roles that J.D. Vance, Governor Walz played, the role the military played in shaping them, the roles that they played in the military. They both are military veterans. They both had somewhat different careers from what people think of for military veterans. I think that is a fascinating story of the moment. I think that the evolution of the military, the evolution of the Defense Department, as we get into an era of AI, and as we think about autonomous warfare, as we think both about what will happen in the conflict in Ukraine, what could happen in potential conflict over Taiwan or otherwise with China, as we think about the ways that the United States, the West, track terror networks, I think the role of technology is it's undercovered only because it's so important. It is certainly covered. It's not as though there's no coverage. So I'll take those as my two examples. One of a story that matters immensely and another of a story that, they both matter immensely.
Thank you. One is, I love the Atlantic, and I'm going to flag edition of the Patriot. This one was in November of 2023. It was a fascinating interview you all had with Mark Milley, then the commander-in-chief, about him dealing with President Trump and how he dealt with him, and also the future of the military. So I would just say I really appreciate the Atlantic for being one of the publications that does deep, investigative, and thoughtful journalism around the media. And then I want to build on those topics that you just brought up, which is Walz and Vance. I wrote an op-ed I actually wrote it with some Stanford Law School veterans back in 2012, bemoaning how that was the first presidential election since I can't even remember. I think maybe since like the 19th century that we didn't have a candidate that didn't have veteran status. And what I find so fascinating about the 2024 election is that both VP candidates do, as you noted. And we're having this tremendous debate as to levels of military status. It's like, hey, did you deploy? And who did you deploy with? And did you see combat? I think there's going to be so much more spilled on this topic in the coming days to weeks. And I hope to read some of that in the Atlantic too. And then on Ukraine itself, I feel like you all have done a great job covering the war.
Yeah, I think we have, our editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, who wrote that profile of Milley, has a lot of knowledge about the military, a real passion for understanding the American military, cares a lot about it. And then, of course, the magazine has been, since its founding in 1857, devoted to the cause of democracy. And so naturally, the war in Ukraine is one of the frontline battles over whether democracy will exist, can exist. Will the rules in Ukraine, will the rules in other parts of the West, the area around Ukraine, will they be set democratically? Will they set by Zelensky, or will they be set by Putin? That is a topic of grave concern that ties directly back to our history. So we've been on that story.
The war in Ukraine, for like military historians and veterans, some analogs that people have been making is this is like the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Some people are like, this is the Spanish-American War before World War II. But the most important thing that a lot of veterans are and service members are looking at the war is, how is this the future or not the future of warfare? Because in GWOT era, it was counterinsurgency. It was all about FM 3-24 counterinsurgency, and now it's like drones, and you got trench warfare again. And it's just, I'm curious if you have a perspective on what the future of warfare might look like.
Well, I mean, what's so interesting, I mean, as you mentioned with Ukraine, is that it's a combination of like, it feels almost like, you know, the wars of the past, trench warfare, and the wars of the future, right? The little drone swarms that Ukraine is building. You know, they're building their own capability of, you know, sending drones into Russian territory, right? You can use very cheap weapons to destroy very expensive weapons. My guess on the future of warfare is that the battles one sees in the future are probably more like the ones we saw in the war on terror. Like they are hunting out, they're more like Israel Hamas than they are like Russia Ukraine. But what is so interesting is that what's clear from the last couple of years is that there is no one future of warfare. You know, there are different kinds of conflicts, there are different kind of battles. You can imagine a battle in the South China Sea that is heavily dependent upon our submarine technology, which was not hugely important in, you know, the war in Iraq, or, you know, figuring out how to dislodge Assad, or Israel Gaza, or Russia Ukraine, but in fact could be absolutely essential to defending Taiwan if indeed that comes to pass. So I don't know if there is one. I do think what there certainly will be is there will be much more artificial intelligence. There will be, you know, robotic armies that fight each other. There will be, you know, automatic weapon systems, certainly defensive in nature at first, and then eventually offensive in nature. So you will see lots of technological change, but you'll also see many different fields of battle and areas of conflict.
I teach military history ROTC to cadets, and one of the battles I talk about that's not a well-known battle is the Battle of Coral Sea. And that was the first time Navy ships engaged with each other purely through planes, not through firing at each other. I tell cadets that we probably have just seen in Ukraine, and we just don't know this battle of where drones were just fighting each other. Like right. the actual people, there were no pilots, there were no people shooting at each other. It was drones fighting drones. And I believe that in the future, we're going to talk about this era as like the cybersecurity war that wasn't really even covered, in the sense that countries are going at each other. Stuxnet's obviously one that you all have covered really well, but war is definitely changing. And the impact of technology on war feels, maybe this is too much of an analogy, but technology has a massive impact in your industry, media. And I'm curious, like, how are you seeing those impacts, and how are you adapting to it at the Atlantic?
Yeah, so definitely, you can definitely take a path from question one to question two. Warfare and media are both influenced immensely by technology. They're quite different. So technology is constantly changing in my industry, right? And it is constantly changing the way people read. It's changing the way we produce media. It is changing the way we promote media, and it is changing the advertising business, right? So the most consequential change for my business, of course, was around late 90s, early 2000s. The internet comes around, does a couple things, allows for infinite distribution at minimal cost, and it breaks the advertising model. Obviously, the first thing I mentioned was quite good. The second thing I mentioned was quite bad for my business. A lot of carnage. Media has been one of the few industries that has been more or less in decline since 2000, because we have not figured out a way to create a business model that is as effective and, you know, as lucrative as advertising was prior to 2000, when we essentially had a monopoly on targeting individual readers with specific interests, right? If you wanted to target people who liked technology in 1995, you bought an ad in Wired. If you want to target them in 2005, you bought an ad on Google. If you want to target them in 2015, you bought an ad in Facebook, targeted to them precisely. So the advertising business changed massively. People didn't quite see that at the time. You know, there were lots of different ways that media adapted. There was a period where a number of media companies, some degree of success, really focused on leaning into social media, relying on the social platforms, partnering with the social platforms. Eventually that didn't work, or it worked less well because the social algorithms changed, the social platforms changed the relationship to the news industry. There's a cohort of publications that moved from an advertising-focused business model to a subscription-focused business model. And that turned out to be highly successful for all the places that I have worked at in recent years, at the New Yorker, at Wired, at the Atlantic. And then there are a bunch of other media companies that have built ancillary businesses that have figured out my favorite one. I think it's WGBH in Boston, somehow figured out a way to accumulate extra spectrum, which it then sold for $500 million. Like, there are ways that smart executives have been able to use the brands they have, the reputations they have, the people they have to figure out new businesses. New York Times obviously has used their brand, their money, their network to build up a great cooking vertical, to build out and acquire a great reviews vertical, to build this sort of massively successful bundle. Okay, so technology constantly changes. Media has to adapt with it. We are now at the Atlantic trying to figure out what's happening next, right? We know that in the future, people will experience media more through video than they do right now. We know that audio will be extremely important. We know that the ways that people share will be different. And we know that AI will be extremely important in 10 different ways. And so we are trying to think through all of these changes, figure out what we're good at, and then figure out what our place will be. The last couple of years have been mostly about optimizing the way we reach readers through a subscription model, through a paywall, through, developing direct one-to-one relationships with readers. It has been hugely successful. We've gone from being unprofitable to being profitable. And the question will be whether we can keep that up.
I'm curious how you think about media companies and creators. And I say this because I feel like media at like the big business level is maybe, I think you use the word in slight decline, but I think creator economy is kind of like an explosion. And so like Joe Rogan, I think could arguably be said as big media now, or media in essence. And so how does the Atlantic think about incorporating rising creators within the big umbrella or platform?
It's a really good question, right? So one of the things that has happened, I think, in media, and it also happens in other industries, is a little bit of a barbell effect where you kind of have consolidation of really big companies and then lots of success in sort of individuals or sole companies, right? So the startup costs to become a creator are essentially zero. Like, you can start your own magazine from scratch. You can start your own podcast from scratch. Makes it very easy to do it. A few people like Joe Rogan are awesome at it and develop huge followings, huge networks, and become incredibly successful. And the other end of the spectrum, there are publications, like a couple large newspapers, a few large magazines that have been hugely successful. In the middle, think of regional newspapers, industry-specific magazines. Many of them have been wiped out. Back to creators. So the dynamic between creators and brands like ours is a little tense, because what we don't want is we don't want the individuals who make up the Atlantic, the writers you read, voices the voices you associate with us. We don't want them to leave and go start their own thing. But obviously, that's on all of their minds. And so we have to make it more valuable for those people to stay here. We want them to have their own voices. We want them to go on TV. We want them to tweet their stories. We want them to have individual personalities. We've always been a collective of writers, but we wouldn't be psyched if our writer's like, I'm gonna leave the Atlantic and go start my own podcast. So the dynamic between us and creators, we want to some degree, we cover creators. To some degree, we invite creators to contribute to the Atlantic. To some degree, we try to get them to come and become full-time Atlantic employees. But we also try to not have our Atlantic employees leave to become creators. And that's a dynamic that I have dealt with. I was at the New Yorker from 2010 to 2017, and then Wired from 2017 to 2021. Throughout that whole period, I have dealt with that very same issue to some degree of success and some degree of less success.
This is a very much stretch of an analogy, but in the military, we also don't want people who are bigger than the team. The favorite words in the military are probably servant leader and quiet professional. And it's like, you don't boast about yourself. You don't have like a YouTube account with 1 million followers, and like you are part of a team. And so I think, in fact, the military struggles a little bit with retaining talent, especially young talent, because I think a lot of young talent can't fully express themselves within the current construct.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously the consequences are different, right? If somebody in a magazine gets too full of themselves and tweets too much, like maybe they create a bad news cycle. Somebody in the military gets too full of themselves and tweets too much, and they give away battle position, and a bunch of people get killed, right? So the stakes are quite different. But the issue, you're right, is very much the same, where when you lead an organization, you want people to want to be part of the organization. So you want people to express themselves and do what they want to do. But you also have to be very wary that sometimes that can undermine the goals of the organization. So, huge degrees of difference, but you're spot on to note the parallel.
I'm curious, what are some news businesses that do inspire you, whether they're newer or older? And you did mention New York Times and their bundling, but I'm curious, are there any other news businesses?
Oh, there are tons of news businesses, right? So, there's a cool publication that I've found very interesting, which is called Puck. What they've chosen to do is they've hired a small number of people. They've given them financial incentives tied to the growth of the company. They've hired really talented people to cover a small niche. They've, 10 employees, 10 writers. I think they're doing, a really good job of finding a niche. There's a publication I love, not for its business acumen, which is, fine and great, but it's called Rest of the World. And the idea there is we focus so much on the tech industry in the United States. Well, let's focus on the tech industry around the rest of the world. Let's look at the big trends in Bangladesh. And, what they've done that I find so remarkable is, finding an area where there's real moral value for the world, understanding more of it. And then I have intense admiration for every media company. With each sort of new form of technological innovation, there are media companies that figure out first, and they figure out how to do audio really well, right? Or they figure out how to do TikTok really well, or they figure out how to do newsletters really well. And right now what I'm watching is who's going to figure out AI really well? Who's going to figure out AI is obviously huge potential benefits, massive potential risks, right? If you used AI to create stories, you A, will probably create bad stuff, and B, you'll burn the trust of your readers. But if you can use AI to promote your stories, if you can use AI to make your business more efficient, right? There are real innovations that will come from it. So I'm watching to see how our industry handles this transition.
What I find somewhat interesting about the industry right now is how some of the AI companies are paying media companies a lot of money for that content, because generative AI is kind of like CRMs for salespeople. It's bad in, bad out. And AI is also bad in, bad out. And I'm curious, how do you think about that possibility of a revenue model?
Yeah. So, we have signed a deal. We've signed 2 deals that are public. We signed a deal with OpenAI, and where OpenAI has the right to train on most Atlantic content, where we are paid by OpenAI, where we get some control over the products they launch. And then the most important part of it is that we are discoverable in future OpenAI search products. And so that's deal number 1. And then deal number 2 is with a company called ProRata. And what they are trying to do is trying to figure out a way to determine what publications and news sources are responsible for an AI's answer. So you ask the AI, what just, I don't know, what happened with the leadership change last week in Bangladesh? And it gives you an answer. And the goal of ProRata is to be able to say, well, that answer comes, 16% from the Atlantic and 22% from the Substack and 4% from Twitter and whatever. And then to be able to apportion payments based on that. So those are the 2 deals we've done. In general, I think there's a really interesting thing happening, which is that 6 months ago or a year ago, it appeared as though the value of journalistic archives to these large language models was quite high, for just the reason you said, right? Training on high quality data is very important. That value, I think, is probably in decline. It is still there, but it's in decline, in part because they're able to create synthetic data, in part because they figured out so many other ways of getting data, in part because journalistic data is such a small subset. So I think that value is declining. What is massively increasing is the value of new content for their search products, because people ask questions, right? What exactly was Donald Trump talking about with his story about the helicopter? And because large language models are only trained on up to a certain time point, right? Because it takes a long time, a lot of compute to run it. Like maybe OpenAI has been trained up through April. It has no idea how to answer that question. And so they have to rely on news companies to provide those answers. So in general, I think the value of new content is going up and the value of old content for training is going down. And so, we are trying to take as much advantage of that as we can, negotiating with as many companies as we can. And then all the AI companies, they're in a funny situation because what they did is they stole, snarfed, I don't know what word you want to use, but they scraped all of our sites, ingested it all, right? Before anybody said stop, before anybody sued them. And so having done that, they have less of a need for it than if they had not done it. But they also know that they are liable for what they did, or potentially liable for what they did, and they want to, reduce that liability. So they're in a complicated situation where they're both trying to reduce liability for what they did, get data for what they want to do in the future, and develop healthy partnerships with us. They also, the AI companies want the news industry to survive because we create content that will help their future models. So there's a very complicated dance going on, which we are navigating. I don't know if you can navigate a dance. There's a complicated dance going on in which we are participating.
I want to go back to this dance around the military and media.
Yeah.
And that is, and it goes actually to kind of the heart of the Waltz and JD Vance discussion of like military service. And there are some veterans, including myself, who think that sometimes the military gets too much deference because there's so few people who serve. And I'm curious, as someone who leads a major media publication, do you think the military gets enough news, meaning there's enough coverage of it? And then two, do you think it's approached the right way in that maybe the media is not enough investigative, or not, how should I say, maybe it should be more skeptical of what is the official kind of DoD take on a position?
I've never been a military reporter, so I don't have firsthand experience in that. I'll say a couple things. One, I do think that it's very valuable to have people who have served in combat and served in the military who become journalists and who write for you. So I, have often looked for people who have served in the Iraq War and could cover it and write about it. When I was at the New Yorker, we brought in some people who had done that. It's very useful. Firsthand experience, you understand things that people don't understand. So I think it's quite useful. Obviously, there are not a lot of people who serve in combat and then want to become journalists. There's all kinds of other career paths, but it's that's very, very helpful. Do I think that the military gets too much deference? I haven't seen that. I would think that it depends, right? During the Iraq War, I think one could have made the opposite argument, that the media was so critical that there wasn't much deference. Now, obviously, we're at a different time, socially, culturally, politically, so there's much more deference. And back to that question at the beginning, the sort of the Vance-Waltz question, it's forever been an interesting question, right? It came up, you mentioned that I have written about the Cold War. I wrote about the Cold War a lot, in part because my grandfather was an important, Cold War figure, Paul Nitze, the major arms control negotiator. But he was forever kind of on this line where people weren't quite sure. He didn't serve in the military. He was in the Strategic Bombing Survey. And so he was in Japan shortly after the atomic bombs were dropped. He was, procuring metals for the Army during World War II. He was Secretary of the Navy during the Vietnam War. And so there was often both a certain amount of deference because he had such military expertise, and then also kind of a questioning of him because he actually had never served. And so the tension between what is service, what is not service, how do you think about people who actually haven't been in combat but are closely connected to the military, has been one that's been a big part of American politics forever, and one that was, an interesting part of my, grandfather's life.
Let's talk about Nitze for a little bit more. I probably have my history wrong, but I want to say he was part of NSC 68.
Yeah.
And I want to say he might have written a book about I was there at the beginning, or there at the beginning. And so can you share more about Nitze and also the books you've written?
So he was the lead author on NSC 68, which was one of the foundational Cold War documents making the case that we need to develop strategic superiority against the Soviet Union in order to have leverage in future conflicts. And that if we are in a position of strength, that will, lead us to much better outcomes in every other conflict that comes. And so he was on the policy planning staff to help write the Marshall Plan. He's on the policy planning staff. He leads NSC 68. He's kind of on the sidelines for most of the Eisenhower administration. He goes into the Kennedy administration, Secretary of the Navy, well, first at ISA, then Secretary of the Navy, and then Undersecretary of Defense under Johnson, where he actually plays a somewhat interesting role. He's a hawk for all of his career, except for a few moments, one of which is at the end of the Vietnam War, where he very much disapproves of Westmoreland's requests for additional troops in the spring of 1968. So he turns to a certain degree against the Vietnam War, though not really. And then in the 1970s, his focus shifts entirely to nuclear arms strategy, and almost always to the position that, we're underestimating the power of the Soviet Union. We need to build up our arsenals. We need to build up more deterrence. We need to develop first strike capabilities. We need to, make sure that we have, developed the world's best nuclear submarine fleet. So he is a grand strategist. And then in the Reagan administration, so now his career has spanned almost 40 years, he is the lead arms negotiator on the INF Treaty, on the Reykjavik Treaty, and then makes this, big push for, some of the gigantic arms deals that Reagan makes at the end of his tenure. And then at the very end of his life, when he's in his 80s, he calls for the complete abandonment of our nuclear arsenal. Now, whether that was a sort of late stage, old man changing his view, or whether it was the evolution of his thinking is somewhat debated. But that was his arc. So he wrote a book. It's called From Hiroshima to Glasnost. One of very few people, maybe one of two, along with George Kennan, who plays a significant political and intellectual role from the beginning of the Cold War until the end. And he's also a great grandpa. He was really fun to play tennis with and ski with. So love the guy.
So the book, The Hawk and the Dove, Paul Nitze and George Kennan, is Paul the hawk and George the dove?
Yeah. I wrote that book, published in 2009. So it's a history of the Cold War told through the rivalry and friendship of those two men. And part of the reason I liked it, obviously it gave me a chance to study my family history, but also part of the reason I liked it is that Kennan and Nitze, I think it's a lesson for today, were totally disagreed, right? They quite literally believed that the policies of the other would lead to the obliteration of the world. And yet they remained friends. So Kennan went to my parents' wedding. They were like good friends. They spent time together in Washington. They respected each other. They could converse, and despite disagreeing in as fundamental a way as you can disagree. And so I wrote the book to track their parallel lives, to explain these debates, like describing what Nitze was doing and what Kennan is doing is actually a decent way to describe the Vietnam War. You're not going to get the totality of the Vietnam War, but you'll get a good bit of it. So the hope was to describe a lot of the central foreign policy debates of the Cold War through the lives of these two men.
Today in the media, you can't avoid or escape some comparisons between a new Cold War and the Cold War that actually happened. I'm curious, how much do you think that is a proper analogy, and how much do you think it's not a good overlay?
I don't think it's a very good overlay. So, if you think about, there are two ways that people talk about it. One is the conflict with Russia. And there the difference is, we are just we're so economically superior to Russia. It's not really a comparison. Our economic power, our cultural power, our global political power, the difference is massive. Russia does have power. They do have a nuclear arsenal, but their economy is a tiny fraction of ours. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it was much tighter. Then there's the second comparison, which is to China, where I do think there is a lot of, there are similarities, right? And there is a real battle for influence over the rest of the world. There are non-aligned nations that are choosing whether they will use, Amazon, Google, Facebook, or Huawei and Alibaba, right? There is like a technology Cold War. But the big difference is the integration of the two economies, right? The United States and the Soviet Union did essentially no trade together. I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's something like at its peak level of trade, the amount of trade between the US and the USSR is less than 1 day of trade in constant dollars of US and China, right? So the economic integration of the United States and China is so different that it creates a totally different dynamic. And so There are some parallels, but I don't think that there are really great lessons. And also with China, like there were questions about the strategic balance of power between the US and the USSR in 1984. Some people correctly saw that the Soviet Union was much weaker than people thought. And some people, like my grandfather, thought it was much stronger than people thought. Strangely, he led to the policies, the programs, and the compromises that we followed at the moment of the greatest success, and yet appears to have had some of the basic facts incorrect. So got the result he wanted, but perhaps with the wrong analysis. In any case, in China, it's very clear, exactly what the economic balance is, exactly where it is going, and it is also clear that we have massive military superiority. So there are maybe some useful tidbits that can be helpful if you study the Cold War, but you can also, I think actually that probably that the Cold War analogy between the United States and China is unhelpful because once you start to use it, you start to forget about all the ways we are linked together. And so maybe it's a tool that is sort of rhetorically helpful if you were trying to push the United States to a more hawkish position, but is not fully accurate.
Two things to build on that. One is, I think it came to mind for me because of the Olympics, just about the medal count. The last time I was like, or felt like the medal count, at least for countries, was so obsessively looked at was like when I was a kid in the 80s.
Yeah,
with Russia. I would say that there's a big wing of the DoD that views it as a Cold War threat. And I think it's primarily to drive more spending for the DoD. I want to talk about something that veterans obsess about and that you do, and that's running. and we think about physical fitness all the time. And the line is that, like, we joke that one of the benefits of being in the military is you get paid to work out. And we tell veterans that's unfortunately not the case when you get out in the private sector. How do you make time for being a great runner?
Yeah, I do actually think that, it's funny. I was recently at an event with, two folks from SEAL Team 6, right? Two people who were, involved in the Bin Laden raid and, obviously like very fit, very strong. And I went, running with one of them, like the way that I can talk about running was actually something they were respected and interested. It was like it was a bonding force for, maybe for some of the reasons you've just said. To the question, I make time for running because I love it, right? And I force it into my life. I sort of commit to run every day, and I don't worry about the weather. I will run in weird places. I will run in weird situations. I will hop fences. I will run in snowstorms. I will run while on the phone. I will run between meetings. I will just try to get it in. Principally, I run to the office. I run home from the office. It takes about the same amount of time as the subway. And then on the weekends, I'll get up early before my kids wake up and I'll go run. Sometimes I'll go run a long time. And the other day, I was on vacation, so I left the house at 5, but I didn't get back till 10. And the kids were like, "Where were you, Dad?" And I was like, "Well, I have to go run up these mountains." It's a sort of a very important part of my life, and I still run competitively. I still love it. Still have goals I'm trying to set. My kids are into it now, and they in fact go running with me. So I think a lot about, in fact, my next book, which will come out in a year or two, is about my life in running, and about my father. And part of it is about some of the things you learn from running and from the obsessive discipline about being a competitive runner and how they apply to life and to work. And, there's some ways where running is unhelpful, right? It takes time. It can make you narcissistic. And there's some ways in which it is extremely helpful in that the kind of discipline you need to run an even pace for a long period of time and the kind of sort of control of your heart rate, the way your body experiences pain, the way you think about fuel and nutrition, all of those lessons that you learn are actually helpful to being efficient in your job. And I mean, I think that part of the reason why military makes you run, makes you, do so many push-ups is both to make you stronger so you can, carry the heavy rucksack, partly so that you can like handle very hard physical situations, and also partly to focus your mind. and which is what you really need. And so part of what I'm doing in my running training is like, partly physical, but a lot of it is mental.
On your running, do you listen to a lot of podcasts? Do you just like use that time to just think and disconnect?
All right. So very good question. And I'm going to have a more complicated answer than I think most people do. So if I am just jogging to work and it's just like, I'm going to go run a few miles and get to the office, I will listen to podcasts because it's efficient, right? Or I will listen and catch up on the news. If I am doing a workout, I will not listen to podcasts, in part because it's a distraction from the workout, but in part because what you are doing in a workout is learning how to identify different pain signals and learning how to like get your body to adjust to a specific pace and a certain level of effort. And you don't want anything, right? If you are listening to music, right, and you are listening to like music that fires you up, right, you are actually detracting from the mental benefits of that workout. And so I don't do that. And then if I am, like last week where I was up in Acadia National Park, if I am running in the woods, I'm running someplace beautiful, even if I'm not doing a workout, I won't listen to music or podcast because I want to connect with nature and like use it as kind of a meditative process. So I have different modes, like workout mode, meditation mode, and then like work functional mode. And it's work functional mode where I listen to podcasts. Meditative mode, I don't. Workout mode, I don't.
I think it's fascinating that you said how you prioritize it. And it sounds like you always try to do this in the morning when you can. Is that right or not?
Well, it depends, right? So like I prioritize it to different degrees. So if I'm focusing on a race, so let's say I'm 14 weeks out from a race, like I will build a schedule and I will just follow the schedule. And there'll be some flexibility built in, like work out on Tuesday or Wednesday, but I won't ever push it to Thursday. So usually it's in the morning. Sometimes you can't do it in the morning, right? You have to like, I don't know, flying out of the airport and you have to leave at 5, or you have something that's due and you have to work on it at the 6 o'clock hour, or you have to drive your kid to camp in Queens, right? So there are times you can't do it in the morning, in which case I do it late. But, worst case scenario, I do it after I put the kids to bed. Like I've done plenty of runs at midnight. I prefer to hit it in the morning, but you have to be flexible and ready to do it. I've run at 3 a.m. right? You just have to be able to do it whatever time of day you're free.
If you're running in the evening, I will say in the military bases, you're required to wear a reflective belt. And so for your safety, I hope you're doing that.
Yes.
We're now going to go into rapid fire questions. And these are the first few questions are ones that veterans and service members love to know.
Yeah.
What are some leadership tips you have, or like leadership kind of like rules that you just are your go-to ones?
I try to surround myself with people who are exceptionally smart and usually significantly smarter than me in certain areas. And then I trust them very much. I think that's really important. So that's more about team building. I've tried very hard to cultivate habits of discipline, both so that I can, accomplish more and so I can do things better. But I think that one of the most useful rules I have is that I have a to-do list. And what I try to do is I look at it and I try to identify what is the thing I least want to do that is of the most value. And I try to do that immediately. That I think is a very useful rule. So if I'm ever like resetting, it's like, okay, my mind is going drift. Now it's time to focus back in. I try to take the list of things I'm supposed to get done and find the hardest one that I least want to do and do it right away. And I think that's a useful tool for efficiency. In general with leadership, I try to be thoughtful, be patient, listen, set a good example. So I'm not someone who like comes in and like, yells at the team to like do more. I'm someone who tries to come in and sets a good example of doing as much as I can. And then watching how that rubs off. And I happen to have worked with just amazing teams across the board. So I've been very well supported in my professional career.
Who are some leaders you really admire?
The person I've admired the most in my professional career, I've had incredible bosses. I've had, wonderful people across the board. But one person who I often think about is David Remnick, who was the editor of The New Yorker. And he led through a couple of things. One was through example. He never slacked off. He was constantly working, but he was constantly generous and constantly talking to people and constantly trying to get the best out of people. So he was incredibly kind, incredibly gracious, incredibly thoughtful, but just relentless. Sometimes people who really want to win aren't kind and generous and thoughtful. And sometimes people who are kind, generous, and thoughtful don't really want to win. And what I loved about David had both of them. And so sometimes when I'm in a tough situation, I'll try to think through what David would do. Or he had this incredible team around him, his deputy, Pam McCarthy, executive editor, Henry Finder. And I try to think about what they would have decided as a group. So I admired them immensely.
One of the things that you said that I think is really powerful is how Remnick surrounded himself with fantastic other leaders. And that's what I think the leaders that I admire most are those who are able to surround themselves with incredibly capable people. So more rapid fire questions. What are some of your favorite movies?
I loved The Lives of Others, which is a story about the Stasi and East Germany. And it's the story of a man who serves in the Stasi and is tasked with recording a writer, and then eventually has a change of heart about the East German government and flips around. I told my kids the other day that this was my favorite movie. I'm not sure it's actually my favorite movie of all time, but it's a good choice to be your favorite movie because it's so idiosyncratic and particular, but I love that film.
Favorite books?
I'm going to go with my favorite book that I've read recently, which I'll go with two, which is Tim Alberta's The Kingdom, Power, and the Glory, which is the story about his relationship to his father and the battle within the Christian church over politics. And then since I'm writing a book about running, my favorite book about running has been Alex Hutchinson's Endure, which goes deep into the question of mind-body connection and whether pain is physical or a mental process.
Favorite musicians, artists, or songs?
Well, I'm a fingerstyle acoustic guitar, and I'm going to go with John Fahey, Jimi Hendrix, Leo Kottke, Kaki King, and Jimmy Page.
Last question. Favorite travel spot?
I'm going to go for Acadia National Park. I spent a lot of my life there. I love that place.
Nick, this was fantastic. We really appreciate the conversation you had around media, the military, the books you've written, the books you will write, running, and leadership. Thank you so very much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you, Tim. It was wonderful to chat with you, and thank you to all your wonderful listeners, and thank you for your service and their service.